Hey everyone, it's Types, and today I'm talking about gimmick decks and gimmick Pokemon in the Pokemon TCG, and I'm going to be ranking them based on design. So if a card's really well designed, I'll put it in S tier, and if it's badly designed, I'll put it in F tier. And I'll obviously get into this as I talk about the cards. Ultimately, the rankings on this tier list don't really matter, like, at all. But there are some interesting things to consider with these different cards. And gimmick decks, first of all, I guess we should define what I'm saying as gimmick decks. I have 10, these are not all of them, but I think gimmick decks are cards like they're focused on one card or a few cards, and that card, I'm gonna say, like, directly names another card. That's usually like a Pokemon, sometimes a trainer, and then also, or maybe an attack as well, or an ability, something like that. But directly references another card, so you kind of have to play in a certain way. Like you see something like Chimpep Excalibur, those are really intended to be played together, but you don't have to, right? You could play them separately, and they can still do stuff. They can provide value separately, but you can't get value out of Regigigas, at least its ability, without the other Regis. It's literally impossible. It doesn't do anything. So you have to play these cards in a certain way. Regigigas was probably like the worst example. I think it's the only card out of all of the ones here that is actually playable in like other decks. Regigigas I'll play in Lugia, but that's not really what we're talking about either. I mean, it's kind of cool if cards could be played in other manners. I think that's good design, but ultimately Pokemon wants to make gimmick decks these clear decks. And so we will start off with the Regi's deck, and I'm talking about the decks, not the individual cards. But the Regi's deck, if you don't know, is focused around Regigigas and Regigigas from Astral Radiance. They were all from Astral Radiance. There were some other Regis. I guess we'll talk about those, but you have Regigigas with the ability Ancient Wisdom. Once during your turn, if you have Regirock, all the other Regis in play, you may attach up to 3 energy cards from your discard pile to one of your Pokemon. That does not technically need to be a Regi, however, playing it without, like, attaching it to something else is essentially impossible. The only, what on Earth is, oh, is this just Regis? Yeah, this is Regis, but this is with, yeah, Pikachu, X, and Area Zero Underdepths. Now you can do that. Honestly, I don't even know if Pokemon was like how far ahead they were planning. You could do this in Expanded as well, but Expanded is a bit of a weird format. And Pokemon, as far as I'm aware, doesn't really design cards for Expanded. They kind of sort of do, but not really. I mean, we saw with like Dusclops and stuff, they clearly don't put that much care into it. So they are more, I guess, like you can have a bigger bench now, so this can do something else other than just accelerating to the other Regis. But this is obviously intended to be a Regis box deck. We have all the Regis, all 6 of them, and can attack with them. As I said, Regigigas was played in Lugia. Apparently not that much. I thought it was more than this, but Regigigas is played in the Regis deck. We have all of them, and I'm actually okay. Apparently no one's played it. Like just Regis and like since rotation. So they've been bad for a little while. Partially, let's look at Regigigas' attack first. And by the way, it's any energy, not just basic energy. It can be special energy or it can be basic or a mixture. And so we need to talk about that as well. But these were, when they came out, there was Aurora energy in the format, which was any type of energy. And you really did need to use that. But now there's Luminous, and that doesn't really do the same thing. And Legacy energy also doesn't, as it's just a one of. So the Regis, that's why they're worse. And ultimately, for that reason, I think it would have been better if they had been, maybe Aurora had been reprinted for the Regis or something. Regis right now just aren't really, they're in a really weird spot right now, but before Air Zero Underdepths, they were kind of like unplayable because you couldn't really get them powered up, which is kind of awkward. You need to play a bunch of basic energies and do some weird stuff and jump through some weird hoops. So we're not focusing too much on that version of the Regis. We're focusing more so on the one that did see play with Aurora Energy, which I think definitely makes them seem a little better. But then you have Gigaton Break here for 5 colorless, which you can pay using double colors, or no, double turbo energy or twin energy, more or less the same. I guess what mattered was twin, and then you could also powerful colorless energy, increasing your damage by 20, and you could put one of those on. Then you could power this up using just Ancient Wisdom, accelerating 2 twins and a powerful, and then you could be one-shotting a Mew VMAX. Keep in mind these energies aren't helping the other Regis really, but they're not like super terrible either. They're just generic colorless energies on the other Regis, but then you would be one-shotting something like Mew VMAX. Ultimately, this attack is kind of interesting. Again, it's also, as I said, they haven't been good lately. Regigigas was a really strong attacker, and now with VMAX is essentially out of the metagame for quite a while, essentially since V-Stars really took over. Then Regigigas has fallen into a deck that is or an attacker specifically that isn't very good. But let's take a look at the other Regis. So then we have Regi Draco. Regi Draco does have a draw ability. Regi Draco hasn't really, I guess it's seen, no, it hasn't really seen that much play in other decks. It is a very mediocre attacker. It's kind of the generic attacker within the deck, but it is different energy typing. They're all different energy typings, but if you're playing Aurora, it's fine. And so you have an interesting ability. It cannot be like used multiple times, which is kind of random. Don't know exactly why it says that because it's not that good. And then you have the Regi Rock, which is a generic fighting attacker, probably the weakest attack in the deck, not really sure. Then you have Regieleki. Oh, okay. Well, this is the old Regieleki. We'll get to Regieleki in a second. You have Registeel, which is it's just not that good either. Then you have Regice. Regice, I think, is one that I do like a lot in the deck, as it's water, but it does 100, and then says if the defending Pokemon's a Pokemon V, they can't attack next turn, which is interesting because it is a toolbox style deck. I mean, you have different attacking options. I guess you could have a toolbox deck with like different abilities or something, but generally people are referring to different attacking options, and this is one that is solid against different decks as when Vs were good in the format. So it was something that could slow your opponent down and do something that your other attackers could not. Registeel does 220 and 50 less for each colorless, and your opponent's active Pokemon's retreat cost, which is just such a weird attack. It's not like, so it's not something that we've never seen or we don't see super commonly. We see it some, right? But ultimately, it's kind of weird and just it's kind of there for a weakness hitter, but it doesn't always do what you want, and there are ways to reduce retreat. So it's just a little weird, but it's fine. It's not that much more interesting than Regirock, though. They do also have an attack that allows them to set up, and I'm not just talking about super competitive level play here. So the setup attack is good, I guess, but it's not that good. And then there's the Regieleki. Regieleki is a card that is currently probably honestly might be the best of the Regis in terms of like general standard play. And that's because it allows you to recover a trainer from your discard to your hand, and it has a usable attack as well. But the second one is a snipe attack, which is cool, having a snipe attack option. And then the old Regis, you have the Regi Draco, which could hit for 240, but that is grass fire, so that is 3 energy types, or 3 color energies. And then you also have the Regieleki, which is 120 to the active, and that's really what it was used for weakness hitting there, as lightning was one of the best weaknesses to hit. And then you also had 40 snipe to 2 bench Pokemon. You are discarding the energies with the Regielekis, and so I think the Regielekis are solid design. I think Regice is. I think Registeel and Regirock really dropped the ball. Overall, the Regis are solidly designed, but kind of weird. Obviously, they're super limited, and I wish they were cards that could be a little more interesting in other scenarios. The Regi Draco was kind of interesting. Regigigas kind of was, and Regieleki. Did this one see play in other decks? I don't really think it did, but the other one definitely did. But overall, the Regis were okay designed. I guess I'd say B tier. They are big basics as well. You can't put in any evolutions, so you're chopping out a lot of stuff from the deck. It's a pretty linear deck. We just have a bunch of supporters that are getting you by, and it's not super interesting. You have your different attackers, but overall the Regis were kind of whatever. Also, all these cards aren't standard, but some of them certainly aren't really standard relevant right now. I feel like the Regis could have been maybe more abilities, like only 2 of them have abilities. Obviously, Regigigas has the ability that really is the deck. Then you have the Regi Draco with an interesting ability, so that could be a little more interesting. Maybe make a Pokemon that is one colored energy, like maybe you could make Regirock fighting Carlos, and then you can use it with Luminous Energy, because Luminous Energy, as I said, doesn't really work. Ultimately, like it kind of works, but you see all these basic energy types. So ultimately, we'll see exactly how Regi's, their legacy ends up, because some of these cards are certainly rotating pretty soon. And so we'll see what happens with the Regis in the long term, but they're not terrible design, but they're fun. So, like, the gimmick decks, the kind of meme decks that are like this are supposed to be kind of silly and fun, and the Regis did become a strong deck in the metagame, but were never, I don't know, they're kind of beloved because they're this gimmick deck. Gimmick decks are kind of fun as an idea, but in terms of playing the deck was not very fun to play. It was very inconsistent, which is true for most of these decks, and that caused just moments that weren't very fun. Next up, we have, and we'll just go in order, we have, what's this deck called? It's the Swim Freely deck. Swim Freely is not very good, right? But Swim Freely is kind of interesting. There's some really weird stuff to say about it, because we got a new Swim Freely Pokemon recently. Oh no, we got it in 151. So that was super bizarre. But Swim Freely is an attack that does something. It doesn't really matter what it does though. But it matters that the Pokemon have it because there's Finneon, which lets you accelerate as much water energy from your hand, basic water energy as you want to your Pokemon with the Swim Freely attack. This is kind of cool, I guess. And then the what are there? There's the Seaking. There's I think the Luminion also has Swim Freely, and then there is the Seal. Is that I don't even remember the name of what the Pokemon is. Dugong, there we go. I was like, which is it? Yeah, so you got a few, but the Seeking and the Dugong are main attackers. Oh, and then you have the Seadra. But ultimately, Swim Freely's not very good. It's kind of funny and gimmicky, but pretty bad. What did I even click? I clicked TCG player. Apparently it has seen a tiny bit of play, but it's not great. You got the Dugong list here, and I think and then you got Seeking list here, and these are in tournaments of moderate size, and they're like mediocre placements. It's not like it's nothing substantial, but it ultimately isn't. It's only two plays in some. It's not like the biggest tournaments, and this is a while ago as well. But ultimately, Swim Freely is pretty boring and niche, and it feels kind of bad. Like it feels kind of similar to Excalibur came out like a little under a year later. You just look at the two and you kind of compare them. And Finneon's this like explosive basic. I feel like it would make sense if they had made a Swim Freely basic attacker that was a weaker attacker, but allowed for some explosive turn one plays. And right now it's a very boring deck where you are an evolution based deck where your opponent can target down your basics. They can target down your Finneon, your Goldeen, your Seal, your whatever. They can target down your Pokemon. And as you're trying to set up, you're just gonna not be able to make it out because your opponent's just pressuring you in this way. You gotta play Manaphy and Jirachi. I guess this was when Lawson was good, so you saw a lot more Jirachi. But ultimately, Swim Freely is I feel like pretty disappointing. I'm gonna put it in the D tier. The tier list, as I said, doesn't really matter, but Swim Freely is a card or a deck that's kind of silly. I made like a video talking about it I might have made multiple videos talking about it involving like the Thwacky and some stuff, and that was kind of interesting of a deck, but ultimately it's a deck that is pretty silly. It incorporated two different silly things. Then you have Lunatone Solrock. Lunatone Solrock was all over the metagame. Technically, Lunatone doesn't refer to another Pokemon, but Solrock does, and I figured Lunatone was the one that people would associate with it. Lunatone Solrock, as I said, used to be all over the metagame. And you have Solrock with Sun Energy, saying once during a turn, for each of your Solrocks, you can attach a Psychic from your discard to one of your Lunatones. So if you have all four Solrocks, you can accelerate four energies, and that's a good chunk of energies, and you can even use Scoop Up Net and then attach and get some pretty solid energy acceleration here. Apparently, there's a list here. The deck ultimately didn't play a lot of Pokemon. I mean, it played the Lunatones and Solrocks, and Lunatone does 30 more for each Psychic attached to it, which is a mediocre attack. The deck is kind of boring. In my opinion, like ultimately what you're doing is just getting your Lunatones and Solrocks, and it's a very linear, straightforward deck. I guess you could play these with other things. Like there was a Shadow Rider combo thing, but it was pretty weird and pretty mediocre to bad, to be honest. Lunatone Solrock, I think, is ultimately it's a deck that ended up seeing a bunch of play for a short period of time, and that's okay. I think it kind of introduced people to the game in a way where it was a deck that was exciting in terms of like you could do big damage, you're on a single prizer, and it kind of does what you're looking for with a gimmick deck, but ultimately it is very boring. It's definitely one of the most boring decks we've probably seen that have been like, I don't know if I'd say good, but like meta relevant within the last I don't know, within like all the cards and standards. So definitely not one that I feel like is super interesting. I'm also gonna put it in. I'll put it in C tier. I mean, it's like better. Ultimately, you want the decks to be okay. Regi's I think is a fair power level, but Lunatone Solrock's also within a fair power level. I think it's all right, which is why I'm putting it a little higher on the list. But ultimately, kind of boring and very simple and straightforward. And it's not like there's anything really. There's no depth with these. I guess there end up being some depth with the other Lunatone. But they're kind of whatever. Also, without Scoop of Net, you just had less damage output over the course of the game. You'd lose 120 damage across the course of the game essentially, and that's a big deal. Next up, we'll talk about the Pikachu no, we'll talk about Pikachu combo deck. The Pikachu combo deck is, I don't know. Let's just start talking about it. I did talk about this in the rotation video, but you have the Togedemaru. And Togedemaru says with Togedash, you flip a coin if heads during your opponent's next turn. If they knock it out, this Pokemon they can't take extra prizes, and it does 10 for one lightning. So essentially, it does virtually no damage, but it does have this interesting effect on a coin flip. Ultimately, if you flip tails, obviously it just is terrible. It's an attack that essentially does nothing. If you flip heads, it is meaningful. It's not, it's pretty solid, but it's like you might not give up a prize. And you have Dedenne. Dedenne is the next one with a Dede short, which says for one lightning 60. You can only use this if one of your Togedemaru used Togedash last turn and your opponent's active is now paralyzed. There's a good chance that they won't be able to do anything this turn. Ultimately, this is where the first big red flag comes in, though, and it says that your Togedemaru has to be the one using Togedash, which, like, normally, like, what else would you do, right? We could use Ditto, which copies them. Instead of now needing all these different Pokemon, you could just use one Ditto, or, like, different Dittos, or whatever. You could do different things with Ditto to be a deck that doesn't require a bunch of different basic Pokemon, and there are 4 of these, as we'll see. This deck is somewhat reminiscent of the special combo deck, I think, with Hitmontop. This deck never ended up seeing any play. The one that Pikachu combo deck, I don't even know what people call it. No one really talks about it. But the finishing combo deck, the Hitmon Trio deck was like kind of funny. Not super good, but it's a similar concept. You attack with Hitmonchan, then Hitmonlee and Hitmontop. But Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee's attacks were, I mean, Hitmonchan was a deck in its own. I guess expanded with it's a stall deck. It's a hit and run stall deck. It's a really, really boring deck, I think. I don't know too much about it, but I know it's not super interesting. I mean, just like ability locking your opponent and annoying them, and yeah, it's just not like a super fun deck. There's some kind of cool things. Expand is a weird format, but Hitmonchan is kind of cool. And then Hitmonlee's whatever as well, I suppose. Not too much to say about. Oh, apparently Hitmonlee was played in the Hitmon combo deck as well. But then not Hitmontop, because Hitmontop is kind of awkward to use. But regardless, these were okay. But then the Dedenne isn't very good, right? This Hitmonlee's doing a 90 snipe, which is pretty good. But Dedenne is going to be doing like nothing. I mean, it paralyzes, which is okay. And you might get value off of that, but you might not as well. And it's after another attack that also did essentially nothing. So the first 2 attacks are really, really terrible. Then you have the final 2 Pokemon. You have the Pikachu, which I'll talk about first. Pikachu says it does. You could actually use it not in order, but it just doesn't do much of anything. But if you use Dede Short, if Dedenne used Dede Short, you do 200 for 1 on a basic, which isn't that much damage. I mean, it's good. It's quite good, but it's not broken. If there's a Pokemon that's just, it might be broken if it's just 200 for 1 on a basic, but this isn't necessarily one-shotting all 2 prizers. It's just a very mediocre attack. It could definitely be much better, I guess. I mean, I'd probably increase its damage a little, maybe, or just make it not the 3rd one in the cycle. Like, you could make it the 2nd one in the cycle and then reduce its damage, and I think that would make more sense, but it's very hard to get to. Comparing its outcome to that of the Hitmontop. Hitmontop did 60 to everything, which is a sizable spread attack. If you attack with this twice, you very well may win the game. Though not necessarily. This ultimately saw play in a weaker format. In GLC, you could play it, but Pikachu, and you can't play Pikachu in GLC either, which is kind of unfortunate for it, because they could have all been lightning, but they're not. But Pikachu it's kind of okay, and I like Hitmontop's not great either. I think Hitmontop could do more damage. Hitmontop was kind of fun, and theoretically attacking with this a couple times could do really big results. Attacking with Pikachu's just not super interesting of a Pokemon. It's just straight up damage, and you're really looking for something a bit more exciting than that. You do have some kind of weird stuff on the ones building up to it, but it's just kind of weird. Lastly, though, or I don't know if it's lastly, the Morpeko is the alternate to Pikachu. It's kind of interesting having alternates, but this is now 4 cards, and they're really bad, right? They're just quite terrible. But Morpeko does 60 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon. And so there you have that higher upside of Hitmontop, the same, or like, I don't know if it's higher upside, but it's kind of cool. But with the Hitmon's deck, those were like spread and poke attackers versus where you're doing like some more substantial damage with Hitmontop, and then you're doing more substantial you're doing like some snipe damage with Hitmonlee, which kind of synergizes with spread. The Dedenne is, what does the Dedenne even, I just forgot what it, I know it paralyzes. I don't know how much damage it does. It does 60. Okay, so you do have like a more sizable poke damage here with the Dedenne, but the Dedenne is, I think, okay, but the Togedemaru was really boring. I mean, it's on a coin flip, it's completely terrible. On heads, it's okay, but then we just gust around it. Ultimately, these are pretty badly implemented. Now that I'm talking myself through them, they don't sound that bad, and that's probably how the Pokemon Company ends up making them, but they're not super fun because they're just not, right? They're not a deck that is good. It just doesn't work very well. It's weak against spread as well. The Pokemon have lower HP than the Hitmons, and a lot of the gimmick decks have low HP, and that's a big issue. That's something holding them back, and that happens for these decks as well, where you have various like Dragapult EX, that's just going to be destroying you. And so ultimately you're something that is going to struggle to consistently find value and like win. Even if you do find some value, you're not going to be able to turn that into wins. Then we have the, what is this next? The four, no, we'll talk about that one later. Okay, so we'll talk about United Wings. So wait, so these two go together. Oh, and then these two go together. Okay, so we'll talk about United Wings now. United Wings is like Mad Party or Night March as well. They're essentially the same, but you have Watchful as the one will pull up. And Watchful is pretty interesting. Well, I don't know. United Wings is the attack that says 20 more for, or it does 20 damage for each Pokemon, and you just cut with United Wings. There are 4 United Wings attackers. There's Watchful, which does it for 2 colorless on a basic. There is Merkle, which does it for 1 darkness on a basic. There is Flamigo, which has an ability to get your other Flamigos out of your deck into your hand on play from hand, and that attacks. That has United Wings for 2 colors on a basic, just like Watchful, but it is not. It's a colorless Pokemon, so Kill Watchful, or no, Watchful and the what's the other Pokemon? The Murkrow, there we go, are both hitting weaknesses and meaningful weaknesses. And then you also had recently we had the addition of the Rowlet, no, the Dartrix, which is a stage 1 for 1 colorless, which is nice, so you can use either the energy used to pay for Murkrow, or the energy used to pay for Watchful, or the Flamigo, and use that with your Dartrix, and also hits Grass weakness, which is a pretty meaningful weakness right now. Ultimately, weakness isn't something that can really be carrying your deck in the current standard format, which is something holding these cards back, but I do think they have been given the right weakness types, which does mean that this like somewhat pseudo toolboxy thing going on with the different United Wings attackers due to weakness is okay. It definitely feels like fair. Unlike something like Mad Party or Night March. Night March, you had 2 attackers, which meant there were only 2 types you'd be hitting for weakness, and you had a colorless attacker in Mad Party, but that was your main attacker. Versus in United Wings, you have a colorless option, but then you also have that colorless option has an ability, has higher HP. It's not super high, but it's higher than like 60 or 90 or whatever. And then you have the weakness coverage in the other types, which is meaningful. It actually feels like you can use different attackers in different matchups. Ultimately, I think United Wings is way better designed than both the Night March and Mad Party. Mad Party ended up being a fair power level. I think the big thing is that so far United Wings has been, I don't know, similar power level to the what's it called? The Mad Party deck, though weaker, I would definitely say. But on top of that, it's been noticeably worse than the Night March deck, which was a very good meta deck, better than the Regi's deck, which was a solid meta contender, like top 5 deck at a point. The Night March deck was really good. The Night March deck being really good, I don't think it was problematic for the format necessarily, but it's kind of a weird card or weird deck with some serious counters, and a deck with a very linear game plan, and this deck does have a linear game plan, getting lots of these Pokemon in the discard, but with the Flamigo's ability, it has a bit more depth. You also have the Killer Watchful I'll mention, which does 10 snipe for each of your United Wings Pokemon in the discard. It does not have United Wings, so it will not be adding to the damage. It's a pretty terrible attacker, to be honest, because it's not sniping very much, but I do think these attackers are fair. With the rotation of Double Turbo Energy, presumably, I don't necessarily know if this deck will be super interesting post rotation, but so far I think it's been kind of cool. They did the weird thing. They did this with Shrimpruli too, where they printed one of the attackers later on, like a year later. which I'm not a fan of, definitely. I wish they had just printed them all at once. Made it good right off the bat. And I think we've seen some United Wings like cards from in custom card videos. We've also seen some festival lead, which we'll get to in just a moment. But I do think that it's solidly designed. It is linear, but it's solid. We don't have great discard in the format. Nightmares was so good because of Battle Compressor, which just was a super broken card. And you had other good cards in the era as well, which had synergy with the Nightmares deck. But I still think that United Wings is a fair deck. It's decently designed, but could be designed a little bit better as well. Then we have the Diplin Thwacky deck, aka the Festival Lead deck, and there are a few different issues with this deck. Festival Lead, though, is a cool ability saying that you can attack twice if Festival Lead is in play. However, you do need to use the attack on the Pokemon. You cannot use the TMs, which I feel like it wouldn't be broken if you could use the TMs. But then you have Diplin, which does 20 for each of your bench Pokemon. That's going to be doing 100. Double that, it's 200. Doubling means you can take knockouts and kind of do like a spread deck where you're hitting two different attackers if you take knockouts, but that's not always going to be happening, and that's not often going to be happening in standard. You are also hitting a good weakness, but the really cool thing is with something like damage buffs, you can double them up. So Vitality Band, instead of doing 10 extra for your 200 damage attack, is down doing 20 extra essentially, which is cool. But you do need a certain stadium in play, Festival Lead, and Festival Lead is, well, it's really, or no, Festival Grounds, and it's really boring. It just like recovers from special conditions. It's a completely boring stadium and essentially useless. Like special conditions aren't very good, and it's we could talk about the stadium outside of the deck, but within the deck, it's nothing. I mean, it's a card you need, but it's really a nothing card. Wish that they had made Festival Grounds a interesting card. What's this? Apparently, someone played it in this deck for whatever reason, I guess countering something in particular. They're not sure. It does do something, but it's quite niche. So Festival Grounds as a stadium could be more interesting. Could have like searched or grass Pokemon or something. But then you have two other attackers. You have a Goldeen, which is super boring and generic, and you also have Swirlix. And these are useful, and Swirlix is the Goldeen is generic, but Swirlix is way too generic, doing 20. It is a 20 snipe essentially, but it's quite boring. Both are pretty boring. I did mention like some really plus Festival Lead, but that deck's not super interesting. I mean, it's kind of interesting being a matchup of those, but in terms of the Festival Lead like stuff going on, you have Thwacky. Thwacky is a cool card, I think, saying if your active has Festival Lead, you can search your deck for any card. Ultimately, this has pretty serious design. I don't know if I'd say flaws, but it definitely is a card that has flaws when you're actually playing with it, in the fact that if you have, like, your Thwack is in the active, this isn't going to be working. So it's an ability that can be turned off and on at a moment's notice by your opponent or by you, but not completely in your control. So it's a card where things can go wrong pretty quickly, and the deck's a very swingy deck. Thwacky is a cool card, and one I think actually has potential within other decks like Control or something, but Thwacky's just, it's cool. It's a cool card. I do like Thwacky. I feel like Festival Lead could have been better, though, having different attackers, and I've seen a bunch of custom Festival Lead cards, which are cool and would give the deck more depth. The Pokemon has chosen not to, create. They've chosen just to make this a pretty boring and flat deck. It could be a lot better, and I think it is cool, but there are so many things that could be cooler with this. If it interacted with the TMs, the teams were more interesting, you can just do some really cool things with a more toolboxy style deck, but that's not what we have right now. Then we have these last four. These are in, we're going to pair some of them together. We got the 4-as-1 deck. This deck is really boring. The Virizion says you do, if you have the Swords of Justice, which are Virizion, Turaki, and Cabralion, and Keldeo, then if you have all of them in play, this is going to, well, I guess you could be copying this with Ditto, and you wouldn't need that, but regardless, essentially if you have all of them in play, you do 90 for 1, colorless on a basic. This is interesting, obviously being all colorless, and then you have the Keldeo, which is 3 energy, one of which is water, the other 2 are colorless, and if you have all them on your bench, it does 120, and without them on your bench, it's essentially useless. Virizion has another attack as well, which is, kind of nothing. But I think the Keldeo and Virizion are okay designed. I do like the Virizion being colorless, and Keldeo being mostly colorless, and I think it's solid damage output, though it is limited and it's forced to be in a certain way, but I think they're okay. But then you go to the Cobalion. Cobalion has actually seen play. Cobalion from Silver Tempest, and its ability justified losses your basic Pokemon's attacks do 30 more to your opponent's active darkness Pokemon. That's really that's pretty niche, right? That is something that, if darkness is good, it's good to be able to do this with your deck. But then Cobalion ended up seeing play in other decks for you to counter Charizard EX, which is fine, but obviously not really part of the Swords combo. Then your follow-up is your attack for 2 colors, 30 to your bench Pokemon. For each of those Pokemon, search your deck for a basic energy and attach it to that Pokemon. This is a solid attack. I honestly don't mind Cobalion, though feel like its ability could be a bit more interesting. Like, I guess there's the idea of like Cobalion just countering Darkness type, which is fair thematically, but I feel like the ability could be a bit more interesting within the context of the deck, but it's a meaningful attack. It actually stacks, and Cobalion's not the problem. The problem is Terrakion, in my opinion. Terrakion is an awesome card. Terrakion's a really fun card, but it's not a fun card in the deck because you're playing right now. The only type of energy you're playing is water, but you unsurprisingly are going to add in fighting, but now with Terrakion, it's 2 fighting. This is the big issue for me. I think it should be just 1 fighting. Then it does 120, and during your opponent's next turn, you're immune to all damage, but you cannot use this attack again. This is an attack that's completely separate from everything else. You have the 2 main attackers, which are directly synergistic with the other cards where you need the other ones in play, and then you have the Cobalion to support them with its attack and its ability. Terrakion's just out here doing its own thing. It literally has no synergy. It has a super high retreat cost. It's unpayable if you are focusing on Keldeo. Like it's really unplayable if you're not playing fighting. Terrakion's a card that has seen play. Again, like the Cobalion has seen play within Lost Zone and within mostly Lost Zone. You can do some like weird fighting stuff. Fighting's been pretty bad, but if you're playing Fighting Box, Terrakion might be insane, to be honest. Terrakion's a really cool card that I've played with some, and I feel like has a lot of, I guess, untapped potential within design space with this immunity sometimes. I feel like immunity can be cool, especially when it's not something that's just like spammed all the time, which it can't be spammed. So I do think Terrakion is a fun card, but there's a lot of there's a big issue with this card. I'm gonna put this in C. No, I'll put it in B tier as well. No, C tier. I guess. I don't know. I guess the Forest One deck hasn't really seen any play, which is a bit of an issue from balance. Balance is not the main thing, obviously, that we're talking about here, but it is something that is certainly, something you have to consider. But the Forest One deck is kind of like the Uxie Mesprit Zelf deck, and Mesprit's the only one that refers to the other ones. I wasn't really sure if this like applies, but Mesprit says if you need the other 2 on your bench, the Uxie and the Zelf, and it does 160 for 2, which is fine. And of course, they're all psychic as well. A Zelf, if you don't know, does 10 more for each of your opponent's for each damage counter on all your opponent's Pokemon, so that's like a damage ramping attack thing. Then you got spread with the Uxie. Ultimately, Uxie and Zelf are really interesting cards, and Mesprit is kind of whatever. I mean, it's okay. We often see the Uxie, Mesprit, and the Zelf team up with directly referring to each other, but oftentimes it's with abilities, not attacks. So this Mesprit feels kind of generic. It somehow feels the most generic out of the 3, despite being the most gimmicky, which is usually the other way around. Usually it's like the gimmick makes it feel unique. Not necessarily super cool unique, but doesn't make it feel unique. But Mesprit doesn't really feel unique compared to the other 2. Uxie's spread is honestly pretty generic, but it is a cool and usable spread attack. Uxie is definitely one of my favorite cards from the new set, if not my favorite card from Surging Sparks, and it's really good for just spreading damage. Oh, apparently someone played Kofu. I guess I gotta check that out later. It's a Dusknoir, my favorite. Obviously Dusknoir is good, but regardless, Cofagrigus is kind of cool, and you have some fun spread stuff here. Zelf is like a spread support Pokemon. Uxie's just a spread Pokemon, and the deck's kind of spread like Mesprit being this Pokemon that can come in and do big damage is important for spread decks. Spread decks often have a pretty major flaw with the fact that they can't one-shot Pokemon. However, Mesprit's also not one-shotting Pokemon. A Zelf can in the late game, but you can use Mesprit into a Zelf to, two-shot, but that feels kind of boring. I feel like Mesprit could do, I don't know, you could do something that is a bit more tying into the Uxie and the Zelf. I'm not a hater in Mesprit at all. I don't think it's terrible design. I think it's solid design. I am going to put these, I guess, in S tier. I don't know. I mean, they're my favorites. So, this is not a video that's supposed to, the tier list doesn't really matter that much. But I do like the trio. the Uxie and the Zelf are really cool cards, and they have some amount of synergy with the Mesprit, I guess. Like, they kind of have synergy together, but the Mesprit's kind of just off doing its own thing. Also, the Zelf is Psychic Colorless, and so it can use Counter Gain, which is in the same set, and unless I've seen, they play Counter Gain, though it's not that good in the deck, to be honest. But then Mesprit, I can't use Counter Gain. I would like to see that. Also, has another attack. His attack is like energy acceleration. It's okay. It's kind of generic though. But Mesprit is a really cool card, one that I would love to see be cool, but it's not that cool, you know. It's kind of overshadowed by the other two, in my opinion. But then we have these last two decks. We have Breaks In. Well, okay, these are kind of weird. The gimmicks aren't exactly with these cards, but kind of is. You got Breaks In, you got Kofu. Breaks In is a card that, and there's also the Delphox, which is more or less the same. I'm not going to talk about it though. Breaks In has seen a decent chunk of play, with arguably being the main attacker in Zoroark box. Zoroark is a card that like a bunch of different stage ones, but this is 2 colorless. It does 60 for each Serena in your discard pile. And Serena is a supporter, and Serena says, and this, I don't know if this counts for like the way I define Gimmick. It is referring to a supporter here, but Serena is a supporter that says you can choose one or two options, either discard up to 1 to 3 cards from your hand and then draw until you have at least 5 in hand. And then you have another option to gust up a Pokemon V. These are both really solid options. This card still sees play in the standard format now, though it doesn't see that much play. It's definitely fallen off some. In my opinion, there's a point at which this was the best supporter in the game, where it was like almost as good as a Professor's Research, noticeably worse than Professor's Research, but not like a, you know, if we had to play this instead of Research as the draw, it would be like a disappointment and would see less play, but you know, you could still get away with it. But then you also have the gusting effect, which was almost as good as boss orders. Like almost every card in every Pokemon that was played was a Pokemon V. So this was kind of insane for like one format, because this was the last set in the Scarlet or in the Sword and Shield era, and then Scarlet and Violet came out, and this card pretty quickly lost value. But Serena is a cool supporter. I would have liked to see it like literally any other set than Silver Tempest and Sword and Shield, and I guess Crown Zenith as well. That would also be pretty bad. But Serena is a cool supporter. We're not really talking about Sabrina here though, but Sabrina does discard cards from hand, and that's really important for Breaks In because it allows you to get your other Serenas in the discard. Comparing that, and this is like fine. I mean, I think Serena is a cool supporter. Bricks is honestly pretty generic, which is fine, pretty simple and straightforward. That's not super bad, but it's not super interesting design space. I guess I'll put in B. It doesn't really matter, and I'll say A. End up seeing play. Being colorless was nice as well, so you could do other things with it. The Delphox could have definitely been better. Not really too much to say about it. Its attack is the same, but for 1 colorless. And then you have another attack, which is like versatile for 2 colors, which is cool, but no one really ever played the Delphox as far as like you could see it from time to time, but I can't think of any time that I've really seen the Delphox. So the Breakson was definitely the star of the show here. And then you have Crabominable, and the Veluza as well. That's not Crabominable. I'll pull up the Veluza. Veluza is, now I'll pull them both up. And they have the ability Food Prep, and you have the Crabominable from Stellar Crown, and it says attacks used by this Pokemon cost 1 colorless less for each Kofu, and you discard. This is 4 colorless, and when water, it does 250, and can't use the same attack next turn, which is kind of like random. And then you have Sonic Edge hitting through effects, and it's the same thing, but for 4 colorless is your attack cost. I wish Crabominable was maybe all colorless, and then you could tech it into other things or tech other things into it. And then the issue is also Kofu is a supporter that doesn't discard anything from your hand. You put 2 cards from your hand on the bottom, then draw 4. It could have just said discard the 2 or discard 1. I don't know. They could have changed this so it discards. This does not obviously help you get your other Kofus in the discard. The Pokemon are super generic. I'm going to put it in D tier here. I almost want to put in F tier. And I'm going to put in F tier. I feel like, I mean, it makes the thing look nice, you know. It's all symmetrical. But Kofu is it's a much less interesting supporter than Serena, I feel like. Or Serena, not Sabrina. And it's seen some play, but I mean, the decks it's seen play and are also really boring. So, well, I guess it has interesting value here with Palafin. I think that's literally the only the only thing it has interesting value with. The other stuff is just control, so you don't deck out and lose all your resources. But That stuff could apply to any deck, but it doesn't because, it's a very mediocre to bad supporter, but it's also a support that doesn't really have synergy with the Veluza. And the attacks, it's kind of a weird design space, reducing attack costs because now you have 4 Kofu and you want to be able to get value out of each discarded Kofu, so the attacks need to be at least 4 colorless energy, and that's a lot. That's like very hard to pay. And you're not going to be getting 4 Kofu in the discard consistently, so they're just going to be these attacks that are super expensive and are really hard to pay. Ultimately, I feel like this could have been done a lot better, and I do like the breaks in design a lot more, and I do like the Uxie Mesprit Zelf design more than the swords design. The swords design is like interesting, has potential, but ultimately we'll see where Pokemon takes the gimmick decks. I feel like they're kind of okay with the spot they're in. I don't completely despise them, but they could be more interesting and better and things like that. They feel kind of custom cardy at times, and that's okay. I think that's fun to see some cards that are a little silly. And there were some other gimmick cards that I was looking at, but they were both boring and not really played like really bad or just kind of bad and boring. But tell me if you want me to talk about other cards like this in the future. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. Consider liking, subscribing, hitting the bell, joining the channel. And as always, I'm excited to see you in the next video.